From a geographic standpoint, the term Eurasia is typically used in reference to the supercontinent, a portmanteau or combination of the words Europe and Asia, which actually makes a whole lot of sense considering the term continent is extremely inconsistent to say the least, since the continents of Europe and Asia are completely connected and only divided due to historic, cultural distinctions, as I've discussed in a past video, which you should definitely check out. But technically, this means that the entirety of the population of both Europe and Asia should be called Eurasians, in reference to their habitation of the Eurasian supercontinent. But generally speaking, the only ones who adopted this moniker were the Soviets, seeing as to how their gargantuan country didn't exactly fit the definition of either European or Asian, since they spanned both regions in a significant capacity. However, nowadays in English vernacular, the term Eurasian is most commonly used to describe those of mixed European and Asian descent, usually more specifically in reference to East and Southeast Asians, as that is the most common usage for the word Asian. This new generation of Eurasians born in the Western world, the bulk of whom are fairly young and currently number in the millions, are a diverse hodgepodge who really have no larger social or cultural connection other than a somewhat similar parental heritage. But this actually isn't true for all of these so-called Eurasians, as some trace back their heritage many hundreds of years as a result of complex and nuanced history. As opposed to the newly formed Eurasian communities in the US, Canada, or Australia, who really have no solid core identity or community, normally just identifying predominantly with the specific white or Asian community that they have ancestry from, there were in the past large groups of people whose communities were a real synthesis of both European and Asian genetics, culture, and language, and actually still do exist in the present day. Just in case you're curious, obviously I'm not calling them the original Eurasians because they were the first inhabitants of Eurasia or the first people of mixed European and Asian descent, but because this is actually where the term Eurasian was first used in the English language, in reference to the growing mixed-race population in British India of European and native Indian descent. Now, for anyone who thinks it unprecedented that coherent communities could form as the result of intermixing between two or more extremely genetically and culturally disparate groups, the modern people groups of Central Asia, including Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and the province of Xinjiang in China, are all predominantly Turkic-speaking Muslims who are a result of the conquest of the previous peoples of Scythian, Sarmatian, or other Iranic extraction, who were somewhere in between those of Europe and the Middle East genetically speaking, while the conquerors and migrants were mostly Northeast Eurasian tribes of Turkic and Mongolic origin. Admittedly, this was a gradual process spanning many centuries, although accelerated under the devastation wrought by the Mongols. And today, although it may seem like the Turkic civilizations won out, it was much more of a process of mutual assimilation and cultural exchange, with the Central Asians keeping the language of the Turks while adopting the Islamic religion of the Iranians. A more recent example of this synthesis of disparate peoples would be the multiracial Latinos, most of whom have major European, Native American, African, Middle Eastern, and other ancestry, of course in varying percentages depending on self-identified ethnic group, region, and socioeconomic position. And yet despite this, the vast majority of Latinos do not self-identify as multiracial or mixed race, especially in the US, where Latinos of all shades have grouped together, or rather have been grouped together under a single pseudo-ethnic bloc that distinguishes itself from all other groups. Although the majority of Latinos today are at least nominally Catholic and speak Spanish as a first language, it's easy to see the impact of Amerindian, African, Jewish, Arab, and Gitano communities on the modern culture of all Latinos, regardless of race or appearance. And contrary to some depictions or mainstream thought, the vast majority of intermixing was not proliferated by force, as both European men and women, as well as Native American men and women, all participated in the ethnogenesis of these new races, albeit to varying degrees of contribution. Now, the main difference between the European colonies in the Americas and those in Asia were that most of the Americas were treated as settler states, meaning that because the vast majority of the indigenous population was wiped out through disease or warfare, this opened up the opportunity for large numbers of Europeans to settle in these continents, often bringing significant numbers of African slaves with them to replace the Amerindians. This was undoubtedly not the case for the vast majority of colonies in the continent of Asia, as for one, the political and cultural situation was often far too tumultuous to sustain a significant foreign settlement, and two, these were already some of the most densely populated regions on the planet, and hence were used mostly for monetary and political reasons rather than being used as a new frontier for their burgeoning populations. However, this doesn't mean that they were entirely devoid of colonists who arrived early on and may or may not have initially had the intentions of making this land their new permanent home. The vast majority of Europeans who came to the colonies of East, South, and Southeast Asia were involved in some form of colonial administration, whether it be in the military or politics, while others were mercenaries, explorers, priests, or independent traders who came with no allegiances, pretty much only seeking to make it rich. Although the majority of these migrants eventually did make it back home, some would actually settle down in these new exotic locales, oftentimes intermarrying into the local communities, and it's been well documented that many Europeans took such a liking to the native customs and cultures that it was not too uncommon for both male and female Westerners to completely assimilate into these civilizations, often learning the language, converting to their religion, and taking a new identity, as there are even such documented cases of generals in British India going native, so to speak, which was greatly frowned upon and discouraged by the British government. However, other times the reverse was true, and it was the native spouse that assimilated into the European civilization, and the offspring of said unions were given Western names and brought up in the religion and culture of the domineering European power, although oftentimes speaking unique Creole languages that were a mix of both the European and Asian tongues. This is what gave rise to the multitude of Eurasian Creole communities that would eventually become their own distinct people groups, and these exist in many countries around Asia, and each one had a unique way of forming, although almost all of them started with only one mixed individual who would either marry into the white or Asian communities, or would marry another mixed individual, and the offspring of those two ended up marrying others of similar heritage, and so on and so forth, forming into a conglomeration of different cultures, but retaining their European base. As mentioned earlier, one of the first examples of this would be the formation of the Eurasian Anglo-Indian community, who actually had all sorts of diverse ancestries from both Europe and South Asia, although predominantly from the British Isles, including English, Welsh, Scottish, and Irish. Another example of a Eurasian community in a nearby colony was in the Dutch East Indies, or modern-day Indonesia, when a moderately large number of European colonists settled across the islands and intermarried into the native population, and their descendants married each other, creating a hybrid people known as the Indos, or Dutch Indos, similar to the Anglo-Indians. Similar to the Anglo-Indians, the Dutch Indos enjoyed a more privileged status than the natives, although not quite as high as the full-blooded Europeans, and would often act as mediators or interpreters for colonial purposes, although keep in mind, many in these communities were also quite active in the independence movements for their countries and were later declared patriots for their cause. A unique case of Eurasian descendants would be in the Philippines, where, contrary to establishing their own independent communities, there was a high degree of integration between the half-caste Eurasians and the native Filipino populace, an act heavily encouraged by the Spaniards in order to aid in the assimilation process. The percentage of Filipinos in the present day that have major European ancestry, as in 50% or above, is most likely less than 1%. And this is due to the fact that over the hundreds of years of intermixing and integration, the mixed-race Filipinos had thoroughly dispersed into the native populace, no longer forming the dominant class in the island. But what's interesting is that not only did a significant number of Spaniards settle in the Philippines, but also a smaller number of Latinos from the Spanish-American colonies, such as Mexico or Peru, and hence there is a lesser degree of Amerindian admixture in the Philippines, albeit less common. Now, to answer the question, no, not everyone in the Philippines with a Spanish surname has significant Spanish ancestry, or any at all for that matter, as although a large portion of the native Filipino population today has a Spanish-derived first or last name, this is due to a policy induced by the Spanish early on. So I wouldn't call Filipinos Hispanics by any stretch of the imagination, as the Spanish influence on their gene pool as a percentage is likely only in the single digits, and they still have far more in common with their fellow Austronesians of the Malay archipelago than any Latin American nation. Other examples of distinct Eurasian communities would include the Macanese and the former Portuguese island of Macau and the Kristang of Malaysia, two Catholic groups of predominantly Portuguese, Chinese, Malay, and Indian ancestry. The Burghers of Sri Lanka were actually divided between those of Dutch, Portuguese, and English heritage, reflecting the different periods of colonialism on the island, and the Anglo-Burmese, a group that, similarly to the Anglo-Indians, are a product of the British Raj. In many Asian countries with a more tumultuous and hostile post-independence history, oftentimes these Eurasians would either conceal their ethnicity or assimilate into the mainstream society in order to avoid persecution. And foreseeing this, the European powers attempted to construct artificial nations in order to house their progeny in these countries, such as a plan to relocate all Anglo-Indians to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and declare an independent state. Although virtually all full-blooded European colonists in places such as India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Burma fled these countries after independence, a huge chunk of the Eurasian community stayed behind. Although in the past several decades, there's been a higher than normal emigration rate for these communities, especially to Western English-speaking countries such as Australia, the United States, and Canada. Keep in mind though, just like the Latinos, their ancestry is more of a spectrum, rather than having all members be 50% European and 50% Asian, as some Eurasians may have only a small degree of European DNA, since oftentimes a native would be accepted into the Eurasian community merely by converting to Christianity and learning their language. An increasingly large portion of the younger generations are no longer marrying others from the same community, and this is simultaneously diluting the unique culture of these different groups, as well as making their identity and practices more mainstream, although it's unknown if these groups will survive to the future as distinct ethnic groups, or whether they will be absorbed into the prevailing population. So please let me know your thoughts on these different Eurasian groups, and for today's poll, let me know which Eurasian community you find to be the most interesting. And as always, thanks for watching everyone. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.